Hello! Today I'm returning to Final Fantasy X, and following my recent spate of episodes on this entry, I'm reminded of one of the more contentious elements of the game, which far from being the questionable allegories of the Catholic Church, or the innovative departures from previous Final Fantasy titles, is of course how we should be pronouncing our protagonist's name. Now, it's interesting to look at why this is a cause for debate in the first place, and it roots back to two key things. Firstly, there's JRPGs and their penchant for the occasional ridiculous naming convention, which Squaresoft is certainly guilty of. But secondly, despite all its innovations and push towards a new style of Final Fantasy X did retain, overtly and subtly, many legacy aspects of the RPG genre, which includes some player agency into the world, and the freedom to name the protagonist and project some aspect of self or some aspects of one's own fiction into the game. And it's this sort of element that roots all the way back to tabletop origins of the RPG, such as Dungeons & Dragons, and so on. And I suppose, with the benefit of hindsight, this degree of liberty, though limited liberty, is one of the more curious aspects of Final Fantasy. And while it was a novelty when I was 11 years old, loading up Final Fantasy VIII after a decade, and not knowing who any of my summons were, because I'd named them ridiculous things, or having a Final Fantasy VII party comprised entirely of swear word names, in retrospect it does seem a bit of a weird custom to introduce to the games, though it did perhaps spare us all the pain of having to try and pronounce some of Square's character names. So, moving on, Final Fantasy X's protagonist has long been embattled between numerous pronunciations, the most favoured of which are either Tidus or Tidus, neither of which is particularly pleasing to the ear, which is why I imagine they're so desperately contested as the lesser of two evils. But kicking off, first with Tidus, this is an interesting one, because it has a degree of symbolism appended to it, because our hero is considered by some fans to represent the element of water, and thus, much like the etymology of Laguna, Squall and Rain in Final Fantasy VIII, for example, which has its own watery connotations, the pronunciation of tide in Tidus would equally lend itself to the element of water. But I think really breaking it down and assessing this argument, it is worth considering how and why Tidus would represent water, and to what degree he actually does represent water, all things considered. And that's not to say I'm dismissing the argument, but I haven't found too much reason for the connection to exist throughout my Final Fantasy X playthroughs. And for example, with Laguna, Squall and Rain, the water connotation was a very significant yet subtle semiotic hint at the family ties between them, and also used to posit Squall against the fire wielder Cypher and his thunder and wind companions Raijin and Fujin. So, turning to Tidus, the root of this water connotation is largely around the fact that he wields the Brotherhood sword, which is an elemental water weapon, and it's his signature weapon, so I agree that there must be some intent behind that and some significance for water being bound to that. But equally, the sword is called Brotherhood because it was never intended for Tidus, and it was a gift from Waka to Chapu, and depending on how you interpret the lore of this game, and as I suggested in my recent Final Fantasy X retrospective, there is a case to suggest that Tidus is an inadvertent hero, or even a non-hero, stumbling into this story as the player's window into events of Yuna's story or Auron's story. And so he appropriates hero artifacts and a hero status that wasn't necessarily intended for him, and a prime example being Chapu's sword. Furthermore, iconography such as him being stood in the sea in the cover art, being a Blitzball player, and other such stuff, is as much a product of Spiran society, being surrounded by water, being a maritime people, and Sin being a primarily aquatic beast who notably transits through water and deposits people like Auron and Tidus via the sea, such as when he first arrives at Barge Temple and later waking up on Besaid Beach, all being important moments in the first act of the game that don't necessarily denote an elemental significance of water within the Tidus character himself. However, one thing I will say in defence of the water theory, which may or may not influence the name, as we'll see, is that if we were to suppose that Tidus does inhabit water, it would make sense, as with the aforementioned Final Fantasy VIII, that he has an elemental counterpart, And looking at Jecht, who is Tidus's true foil and personal antagonist within the game story, this guy does have an aesthetic about him that leans towards the element of fire, if not in naming conventions and etymology, then certainly by way of visual design. Because really looking at him, Jecht has a lot of black and orange flame-like patterns on his attire, and as a final boss, he once again has a lot of flames and fiery stuff around him. So perhaps there is some sort of connection there, but nothing overt enough to inform the themes and the meta of the game story. So that's largely been the case for the Tidus pronunciation, along with the fact that many fans just hate saying Tidus. But turning to the latter pronunciation, I've only recently leaned towards this way of saying it, because as a notoriously terrible pronouncer of Final Fantasy names, I used to simply call him Tidus. I think I called him Tidus since the game's release for well over a decade, and that was until I saw a video by his voice actor, James Arnold Taylor, in which he states that he's always called him Tidus. Now, I certainly wouldn't suggest that the voice actor of the game is the gospel of truth here. However, Taylor does go on to describe in that video how nobody at the time had any real concern or knowledge or direction for how that name should be verbalized. And so he ran with Tidus, and that subsequently echoed out to the teams he worked with and all the people in his orbit. So Tidus was kind of generally adopted, according to Taylor, within those teams. And in subsequent releases and spin-offs, it does seem that this way of pronouncing his name has been canonized to a certain degree, with Yuna calling him Tidus in Final Fantasy Dissidia.
Tidus. Huh?
And Waka also calling him Tidus in Kingdom Hearts.
Me and Tidus, we are gonna do a little exploring today.
So it does feel like, unlike Tidus or Tidus, that the latter is becoming a more legitimate term. Although I do think someone has pointed out a while back that Selphie calls him Tidus in Kingdom Hearts 2. So perhaps Square are just trolling us at this point. But it's something I've always thought was interesting to consider. Obviously it's just a light touch, sort of aesthetic element of Final Fantasy, but it is one that people tend to draw attention to and sort of return back to debate once in a while. So there we have it, a short take on the eternal debate around Tidus, or indeed Tidus, among the other names that float around for him. If you got this far, thanks very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And let me know your thoughts on how the heck we should be pronouncing this guy's name.